a very beautiful community. It's lovely to be with you after a day or two away for reasons of health extremity again. So let's talk a little bit in a grounding way about the relentless insanity of the Trump administration. From his tariff scam to his indulgence of the idea of the ethnic cleansing of Gaza. Now, where we are together right now in the West is that we're coming out of the bay and going into open water. In other words, the boat, that's our democracy, is on that journey. It doesn't mean it's going to sink, but it means it'll get a lot more bumpy. And where we are in that process of democratic decline is probably toward the end of the beginning. We're still in the early stages of it. So we're coming out of the bay. We're perhaps half a kilometer out of the bay, but we're very much still in somewhat protected, semi-protected waters. It's a lot more bumpy and it's scary. It's scary because it's bumpy, and it's scary because there is a transformation. That's to say, the way things work is different. The role of the United States in the world is changing. Trust in institutions is changing. The prospects of political liberalism are changing. So partly what's scary is the bumpiness of it, but partly what's scary is that the rules of the game are different. You may not just be in the bay and suddenly you're all over the place, you're coming out, and how is this going to work? The level of bumps we're feeling is to the lighter end still, and they're going to get medium, and they're not necessarily going to get high in any Western country in the next couple of decades, but they're going to get worse. And so what we are frightened of now is still, a version of light bumpiness trending toward moderate bumpiness. And we might get to the higher end of moderate bumpiness in the next 10, 20 years. But most Western democracies are not likely to sink, but some could. So that's the predicament. Now, the international dimension here is that we're witnessing US imperial decline. And you know that I'm not particular about you using that word. You don't have to call the US an empire. I do. But this is really a matter of, a conversation we don't need to get ourselves into. And you know that empires can have malign and benign characteristics. No empire is simply benign, but there are different constellations of benign and malign quality in empires. And as you know, I recommend supporting strongly the benign projection of US imperial power in supporting Ukraine. But what's important to understand is that the decline of US imperial power is inevitable. It's an historical process. And again, we're at the beginning of it, or at the end of the beginning of it. What Trump is out to do is reverse it. But you can't. And if you try to reverse it in the clumsy ways Trump is trying to do it, you're simply going to accelerate that. And so an inevitable byproduct of the Trump administration will be the acceleration of US imperial decline. And putting this a little bit more directly, right, his crony imperialism and his arsonism around alliances, normalizes what Xi and Putin are yet to do in the future. So that's a little bit about where we are. Let's say something about Gaza and alliances. There is an important balance to be struck about talking and not talking about Trump, because he's gonna throw up 17 different things a week, and part of the damage the throw up of these things is actually that they get talked about by everybody, even though in practice they may not go anywhere. So it's an important balance to strike in Trump resistance, and there is another important balance to strike, which I'll mention in a moment or two. But in striking this balance, one thing that is important is to call a spade and not to begin normalizing things that aren't normal, right? So you have to call things by their name. Now, somebody might say about the Gaza proposal that you can make an argument that expulsion or even voluntary expulsion is a necessity given what's transpired. But the trouble is it doesn't take you out of the ethnic cleansing bracket, because the question is who has intentionally generated the reality that something is a necessity, right? So if I lower you into shark-infested water and then it's a necessity for me to amputate your leg, sure, that could be a reasonable necessity. It might not be, indeed, and I'm not saying that it is in practice with Gaza, but I'm just saying that even if somebody made that argument an implausible argument, as I think it is, you still don't get away, having talked about point B, from point A, which is that if there even were a necessity, it'd have to be clear that it was brought about by the intentional action of Israel with the support of the United States. Now, what's very important to understand also is that actions in politics aren't just actions, but speech is also action in politics. And the speech of the President of the United States is enormously important. Now, when it comes to threats around some of the United States' basic alliances, and some of the tariff scamming around has been that, what's very important to understand is that words are actions, even if the actions the words imply don't happen. Words generate justified perception of unpredictability around U.S. actions. And U.S. actions here are scammy, as Rory Stewart wonderfully put it, because if you penetrate the political, economic, and military life of different countries for a long time under a stable understanding of what you're doing there, and then you start using that involvement as leverage to extort various things, it's a kind of scam that you can only get away with once, as Rory Stewart has rightly argued, because a second time you're just going to meet a world that increasingly wants to dissociate itself from a situation where the US is politically, militarily, and economically immersed in different countries' affairs. Now, of course, whatever conception of a global order you take, it's impossible to resist the compelling argument that the United States is stronger with its allies, even if it needs to reform its relationship with its allies, and the United States is weaker without its allies. The United States is weaker without Europe on any understanding of what it's trying to achieve or what kind of global order you may be striving for. Now, let me now say something very important about the function of these Trump statements and about everything under the sun and about resisting Trump. Now, when Trump comes up with 100 ideas a day, the function of that, which is different to Trump's personal intent, and it's difficult to talk about it because Trump doesn't have strategies, much, and he has few beliefs. In most places where there would be beliefs in a leader, Trump just has dispositional states that are liable to swing about. And when Trump comes out with 100 ideas a day, whatever it means for Trump, the functional effect of it is to create an impression for citizens that spectacle, speeches, viral clips on social media are politics as opposed to institutions and constitutions. So to normalize the idea that the things that keep democracy on the road aren't important, they aren't the real stuff. The real stuff are the theatrics of leadership, is the theatrics of leadership. That's a very important effect, and it's a corrosive cultural effect. So Trump is undermining democracy culturally. And that's really important to talk about, because most people are talking about Trump undermining democracy institutionally. It's both, but the cultural story comes first. Now, the institutional stuff is important to stress, but also important not to over-panic about. Yes, Trump is somewhat out to break the democratic game, but his efficacy at that, I'd rate it about a 3 out of 10. In other words, a much more hard-nosed project of US democratic self-decapitation would have been led by a disciplined and serious leader like Orban or Putin if they were in power in the United States. So the extreme cultural corrosion is in part a reflection of the incompetence of the institutional corrosion. It doesn't mean that it's not going to do damage, but it means that we've got to call it for what it is and say that it's not worse than it is. Final remark about resisting Trump. It's now the end of the possibility to take seriously people who are making a political career out of resisting Trump just by resisting Trump. You can't do that anymore. Nobody should take you seriously anymore. That project isn't just wrong, it has been defeated at the polls very dramatically. So what you need is a vision. You can't be the Democrats and attack Trump without a vision. Trump resistance without a vision strengthens Trump and weakens US democracy. And to some extent, while there is room for all kinds of voices, there is certainly room for just Trump resistance voices. What I'm saying specifically is that central political forces shouldn't operate like this. Having said this, if there is too much of a domination in media of this sort of Trump resistance approach without a vision, then that too will be a kind of institutional failure of journalism, perhaps. So be very skeptical of resistance liberals who think that the way to beat Trump politically is to just resist Trump. To just resist Trump is to help Trumpisms of various kinds in the future in the United States win. Lots of love.